Coming out tonight. We are very happy to have Sally Yozell here, who I want to give her a big shout out. She got me 2 invites to our Ocean State Department conference the last couple of years, and I got to see Obama last time, so I owe her a big debt of gratitude for making my career meaningful. Because that was definitely so far the highlight, although we were just talking about how it's so sad that there's such this incredible momentum and that it's just heartbreaking that what's happened obviously since last November or like January. But anyway, Sally was at the State Department for a long time and was really a big player in a lot of the work that Kerry was doing on the ocean issues over the last few years of the Obama administration, and now has moved on to the Stimson Center, where she's still continuing her work, particularly on this intersection of the illegal IUU fishing, illegal unreported unregulated fishing, and the security issues. And it seems, as we were just talking, which we'll talk a little bit more about, that that's the one angle that we can still kind of work in this new era, where where the Trump people, if you put terrorism and security next to it, maybe we can still get a few things on the environmental conservation side done. But I will let her talk about that, because I'm just paraphrasing what I'm learning from her. So anyway, let's give Sally a big warm welcome, and we look forward to hearing what she's got to say.
Thank you, Jason. Without opening, it's obvious that we're not in DC, we must be in California.
For real, feel free to talk freely.
People don't even speak like that in the nation's capital, so how refreshing can that be? So yeah, I'm with the Stimson Center. It's a think tank in Washington, D.C. Washington has a lot of them. The Stimson Center is a global security think tank. We got our start, like in the 80s, focusing on nuclear proliferation, which we didn't really focus on until more recently, which is kind of a sad commentary on what's going on in the world. But so whether it's human trafficking or nuclear proliferation, or arms proliferation, or we have a strong China program, the Southeast Asia program. But what was great is a couple of years ago, well, actually about a year ago, they decided to have create an environmental security program, and I'm the lucky one who's running it. I just started in the spring, and it's pretty timely to be doing that. Because as Jason said, in this environment in Washington right now, NGOs, conservation groups are pretty much shut out from walking in the front door of any of the agencies. It's pretty sad. But you can still go in the side doors, I like to say, whether it's the Defense Department or Coast Guard or even NOAA and the CIA or whatever. They actually care a lot about these issues, and they care a lot about the environmental issues, because they're looking at them through the lens of environmental security, and they recognize how environmental security can really impact the stability of both national security and global security. So I'm going to get into a lot more detail on that throughout this presentation or class on my and as Jason said, he was really a tremendous addition when he came to the first Ocean Conference and did a seminar on the blue economy and on the economics. And that is a big part of the environmental security equation, is the economic security equation, particularly in developing countries. Talk a little bit about that today as well. What I'm going to mostly focus on is fishing and security and how they are linked up. So let me just get on with it.
Illegal fishing. Maybe you've done this before on a small scale. But large-scale illegal fishing refers to criminals using massive vessels to steal tons of fish from the ocean. This can include exceeding your quota, fishing without a license, forging or doctoring licenses, using banned gear, or breaking any number of other fisheries laws. Worldwide, experts estimate that about 1 in 5 wild-caught marine fish is taken outside the law. That adds up to 1,800 pounds of stolen fish a second. Illegal fishing makes it really hard to estimate fish populations, which makes it difficult to manage fisheries and keep our oceans healthy. It also damages marine ecosystems and is unfair to law-abiding fishermen who play by the rules. In some places, illegal fishing causes fisheries to collapse, threatening the food supply for millions of coastal residents around the world. There you go.
Okay. So, Jim Toomey is great. Oops, no, I don't want to stop it. All right. Bryce? There we go. So, thank you. So anyway, that really sums it up, so I can actually head back home now. I mean, and is this too loud or is this okay? I mean,
Yeah, maybe we should turn it.
Okay, so basically, this is what I'm going to try to go over today is, give you a definition of IUU and where and why it's happening, and try to connect the security links and how it connects with other crimes, what the US is doing, and some of the potential solutions. And the topic, the title of my chat here today is Evil Fishing. Well, that's kind of, what is evil fishing and where did that come from? It also, it actually was coined by an admiral, a Navy admiral, Rear Admiral Robert Sharp. We did an event recently and he called it evil fishing. And so I'm hoping that by the end of today, you'll have a sense of why a US Navy admiral thinks IUU fishing or illegal fishing is evil. So that's sort of our goals today. So let's first start off with what is the status of some of our global fisheries. And I don't know how much you all have spent in this class focusing on fisheries at all, but over 3 billion people around the globe depend on fisheries as their main protein. 17% of the global population focus on it as their animal protein, their major animal protein. And it's estimated that 93.4 million tons of production took place in 2014. So that's a lot of fish and a lot of people who rely on it. But you probably have heard this, that 30% of the world's assessed fish stocks are overfished, 60% are fully fished, so that means they can turn into overfished pretty quickly. And so they really require careful management. So that's 90% of the major fish population in the world. So what is IUU fishing? I don't know, how many people here have heard of IUU fishing? Okay, pretty much everyone. So I won't dwell on this too much, but it's important to understand the differences of the 3 components of IUU fishing. So illegal, that refers to fishing activities for vessels from one country going into another country's sovereign jurisdiction without permission or license. And that came from the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which gives countries the right to fish and oversee fisheries in the EEZ 200-mile zone. So essentially, illegal fishers on the I part go into another country's waters and literally steal their fish. Unreported fishing, what it says really, is fish that have not been reported or have been misreported to the authorities. And it's fraudulent because it really undermines the ability to manage fisheries, to do a good job managing fisheries. And it really skews fish stocks. And so how do you manage fisheries when you don't know how many fish is being taken out? Unregulated. So unregulated literally refers to fishing activities occurring in areas where there is no fisheries management or conservation measures. And that can be seen in places like on the high seas. We have these 17 regional fishery management organizations that operate outside of EEZs. And they do an okay job. They try to do an okay job as international bodies, and I'll go into it a little more. But they're put together, organized by treaties, and they're made up of a variety of countries that choose to fish in these waters, and there's a bunch of rules that are supposed to be followed in RFMOs. But there are areas that are not covered by RFMOs. There are areas that even in coastal resources, in coastal areas, that don't have fisheries management. And so that's what unregulated can be. So to give you a sense of how much IUU is going on, there's about $15 to $36 billion annually lost to IUU fishing. And so that is lost to the revenues of honest fishermen and women and local economies. Illegal fishers are literally stealing these valuable resources from countries who can, and they're usually the countries, honestly, who can least afford it. We don't have a lot of IUU fishing in the United States because we have such a strong management regime. Those countries, the developing countries that do suffer the most from IUU do tend to be those that are most reliant on fisheries and their economic economies. So the other estimate is that IUU fishing estimates accounts for 20 to 50% of the global fish catch. That means when you go out to dinner, it's likely 1 in 5 of the fish you eat could be illegally caught. But 20 to 50%, I mean, we're in an institute that focuses a lot on numbers. It's a pretty wide disparity of range. And when you think about that, that's because IUU fishing is illegal, illicit. How many people who are out doing illicit activities run to the authorities and tell them how much fish they caught, or how many drugs they sold, or whatever? So it's a shadowy underworld business, and as a result, again, it's really hard to figure out where IUU fishing is going on, how to manage those resources, or what's really going on. So where does fishing take place? I touched on a little bit. There's near-shore fisheries, artisanal near-shore fisheries. That's usually about 8 nautical miles from the shore. There is these exclusive economic zones. Those go out to 200 miles. And then there are the high seas, which cover the rest. As I noted, the most unregulated part are the high seas. And so, as I said, that fishers can also fish on the high seas if RFMOs regulate, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're getting all the information back. There's all these distant water fishing fleets. China in particular, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, they travel all over the world and on the high seas. And they have this system where they can be out for months and months, if not years, because there are these things called reefers or transshipment vessels, where they literally catch their fish, bring them to the reefer or transshipment vessel, and they get sent off to be sold or sent home. So these vessels, they could be out for years if they don't need to come in. Or if they come in, who knows where they come in, wherever they're fishing for maintenance. Fuel can be brought to them, so they don't even have to necessarily come in for fuel. So what does that do? It really makes the high seas a hub for not only illegal fishing activities, but human trafficking and slave labor. It's really, human trafficking and slave labor is running rampant on these vessels that never return to port. And it's really hard to track these vessels when they never come to shore. And then another part I want to focus on is that the UN Agriculture Organization, they estimate that industrial vessels, large-scale fishing vessels, make up 10% of the fishing fleet, of all fishing activities. While small-scale, these artisanal nearshore vessels, make up 90%. But when you look at what the capture rates are, how much fish they're capturing, it's roughly the same. 50% come from these industrial large-scale fish fleets, and 50% come from these nearshore artisanal fleets. So they both need to be addressed in how you manage and try to figure out what's going on. But dramatically different solutions from how to address commercial illegal fishing and how to address commercial industrial fishing and how to address commercial artisanal fishing. And it's important to really focus on the differences of I and you. So illegal, I talked about the sovereign waters, and you, the unregulated and unreported. The unregulated and unreported, that's a really big problem in the nearshore fisheries because they're so vast. I mean, you think of think of Indonesia, where it's like one of the largest shorelines where they have a huge fishing industry, all dotted along small areas, or even Vietnam. It's really tough to focus on that. I'm going to get into a little bit more on that in a minute. So how do fish actually get to market? Fish are literally, like in the United States, this is an interesting fact. Our fish, U.S. caught fish, it's estimated that like 60% goes overseas to be processed. And then it gets shipped back into the United States. So it's no longer, it's then considered a foreign import versus when it was caught here, it was domestic. And if it's sold here, it remains a domestic fish product. When it gets sent overseas, and when it gets sent overseas also, it tends to often end up being commingled with other fish. So you never really know what's coming back, and that's a big problem, particularly in processed fish. I mean, if you ever get a McDonald's filet of fish sandwich, if you ever saw how those put together, it's literally a giant frozen board of fish, a block of fish. It's cut up into those little fillets, and who knows where all that fish came from, because it can either get commingled when it's processed, whether it's on a factory trawler or at a processing plant overseas with other fish, or whatever, who really knows. On the other hand, so that's one type of market, and a lot of the Western nations sort of use that method. On the local scale, though, they tend to go to local markets and don't necessarily come as far as the U.S., although there are new models coming where they're trying to do better jobs at bringing cooperative trade together, artisanal and small-scale fishing communities to really help them do sustainable work, sustainable fishing practices to get those fish to the U.S. where we're willing to pay a higher premium on the market for that. So there's been a lot of work recently in that. So what are some of the major laws that govern global fisheries? There's the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS, that says that countries really have to keep track of the ships that fly its flag. So when a U.S. vessel goes over into the high seas, or is working in our FMO, we are responsible for it following the law and for collecting the information on the fish it takes. So the flag state is ultimately the authority that ships are supposed to follow. But think about that. We in the U.S., yeah, we can do that because we have the resources, we have the laws, but what we often find is that many countries actually lack the political will or the capacity or the resources to carry out this duty of really being responsible for their vessels that are using their flag. And even some countries will basically just sell a flag. It's called vessels that are flagged of convenience. So a country will say, oh yeah, here, Liberia, can you give me a flag so I can go out and fish? And they may have 2 or 3 flags in their, like I used to like to say, they open up their locker, they look in, they pick out whatever flag they want to use that week, and that's what they use. So it's not necessarily, even though it's the international law, it's not necessarily being used. There are 17 regional fishery management organizations, and those are made up, as I said earlier, with the countries who want to fish in that geography, and they're all supposed to work together. They're all supposed to share data. They're supposed to, make sure that laws are being supported, make sure that fishery is well managed. And they tend to focus on really the high value stocks more than others, like tunas. I think there's like 5 tuna regional fishery management. So tunas, sharks, swordfish. And then there are others that, are geographic, like Pacific RFMOs or Atlantic RFMOs that focus more on geographies and focus on the broader ecosystem. But they're really supposed to have science, data, and management, and they really work at varying levels. Some that have been around for like 50 years, like ICAT, they do a pretty good job. Well, ICAT does a pretty good job. North Atlantic RFMO does a pretty good job. Some of the newer ones, or some in the Pacific, off in the distant waters, they do less so, but I'm still holding out hope because a lot of people are focusing on them. I don't know if you're familiar with what we have in the United States, our fishery management councils. These are supposed to kind of mirror what we have in our fishery management councils. So those are some of the major, there's a lot of laws and treaties, but those are the major ones. So then, now we got a sort of a general idea of what governs and how fisheries are done and what IUU is and whatnot. So what is this security link? Traditionally in the security world, national security focused literally on direct threats from other countries or states to the homeland. That luckily has been broadened. And so now our security community, pretty much over the past 40 or 50 years, has broadened it with the face of globalization to include national security priorities that focus on like non-traditional priorities, such as cyber warfare, terrorism, violent extremism, organized crime. These are really transnational threats. And as a result of this shift, what we're seeing is that threat analysis, the national security community has really begun to focus on countering these non-traditional threats. And with that has arisen this opportunity of looking more at ecological threats and food security. So that's why, more recently than in the past, suddenly our intelligence and security community is starting to look at ecological and food security as non-traditional threats. And so food security, economic security, environmental security are all impacted by IUU fishing. And these three factors, they contribute to really competition and conflict. And there's competition and conflict over this growing scarce resource, fish. So while IUU activities deplete global fishing stocks, as I talked about a few minutes ago, and jeopardize human food security, the demand for fish continues to rise. Countries are already experiencing, and countries as a result are already starting to experience those scarcity threats. And this can be seen already, especially in small island nations like Cambodia and Indonesia, where fish is like 50% of the total animal protein, and in some coastal states it's even 75%. So IUU fishing is also threatening the ocean's ecological health. With 90% of the food stocks overfished or fully fished, there is this huge ecosystem strain, and it's only compounded by IUU, where we don't really have a grasp on how much fish is being taken and how best to manage. So we're disturbing the food chain, and it's starting to end up in some ecological crises. Well, so as I noted, IUU fishing is causing food scarcity. Fish scarcity is causing IUU fishing. It's really this cycle. Once traditional fishing grounds within countries' territorial waters, once they're overfished, where are these fishing people going to go? Where are fishers going to go? It's competition on resources. So where do they go? They're going off out of their territorial waters into others' territorial waters. I'll give you an example in China, for example. Their domestic fisheries have really been depleted. I don't know how well you know the topography of the Chinese waters, but they're kind of flat, the water is very flat. Unlike the US, where we have these big cliffs in our water that allow fishing really to recover pretty quickly in our ocean. So they've put limits and closed down their fisheries. Well, while they've been closing down their fisheries, they have been continuing, the demand continues, the economic need is there for employment. So they've been building vessels that can go to further distant waters. So there's a moratorium on domestic fishing, but they've been urging their fleets to go offshore to distant waters and on high seas, as well as to other sovereign countries. And it's important, I want to note that not all Chinese fishing operations are illicit or illegal, but when we talk to a lot of people and experts around the world in other countries, they're certainly operating with impunity throughout the world and across the globe. So, but you know what, China's not alone in this. There are blue-hulled Vietnamese vessels that they pop up in Palau, they're in Indonesia, and you know, as I mentioned earlier, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, these vessels from Asia are just going throughout the world because there is such a demand for food. There's such a high demand for food, fish food in that part of the country. How many people here have heard of Indonesia's Minister of Maritime Affairs, Susi Pujastuti? Okay, so she's like a firebrand. I mean, she's this amazing woman who is the head of their fisheries minister, and she has taken this incredibly hard line on vessels in Indonesian waters. So any foreign vessel that comes into Indonesian waters is interdicted, and she has been blowing them up. She has blown up over 300 vessels in the last couple of years. The good news is she takes the crew off first. But that said, she blows them up, and this has become, you know, it's starting to be replicated by other countries. Like this summer in Malaysia, a 40 burned 2 fishing vessels. So in Palau, they've been doing it on a regular basis with these Vietnamese blue hulls. So, you know, when competition and resources are scarce, you see countries doing things like this. But I have to note that, you know, I talked about the three classifications of I, U, and U. It's important to really think about that because fishing vessels can move between these activities with a lot of ease. And that distinction is important. As I just said, many nations really recognize and react strongly to their foreign fleets encroaching on their own waters. And that's the I part. And it really is a violation of law. But when it comes to their own domestic fleets, the U and the U, that political will is not always as expedient. Some cases they even turn a blind eye because it's just not that popular to get tough on your own, whereas it's very popular to really go after some of the foreign fleets. So the lack of political will is a problem in the U and the U. And you know, I've been to a few meetings in the last 6 months. One was with Vietnamese, where they literally said they did not understand America's obsession with the U and the U and IUU. The Chinese, I was with a group of Chinese in the spring, and some of their fishing leaders basically said the same thing. They do not understand why it's a problem. They do not understand our obsession. So they think it's okay for vessels if they have a legal quota to take a few more tons. Or it's okay if they're fishing successfully and they go into a marine protected area. That's okay. So, anyway. So what other crimes are linked to IUU? Well, the U.S. intelligence community in particular is really worried, and getting more so, about how IUU fishing is undermining economic prosperity because economic instability can really create unstable conditions in a country. I was over at the CIA, in fact, a week ago, and a senior official there was telling me that the intelligence community, they get it. They get really worried when people are displaced economically, when their livelihoods are cut off in developing countries, because they see that they can often turn to other activities, and not all of them so good. So if you have, for example, highly skilled men who are sitting idle, it's not usually the best recipe for peace and prosperity. So think about Syria, think about Somalia. There's some tangential connections to the economic loss of livelihoods in some of those countries, and turning to some of the explosions that have made these countries particularly unstable. So there's also the issue of transnational organized crime. And transnational organized crime can focus on a number of things. It can be human trafficking, it can include narcotics, wildlife, and arms trafficking. And these networks exist and they overlap with the IUU networks. I mean, when you think about it, these transnational organized crime, they don't really care what they're selling illegally, what their black market is. But they use the same vessels, they use the same networks, they use the same money sources and laundering. We had a meeting not too long ago where we had a group of folks up from Costa Rica, and they were telling us about how these fishermen have been known to get involved in weapon and drug smuggling networks. Small-scale fishermen provide fuel to boats that are smuggling narcotics from South America, and in turn then they get paid for drugs. The fishermen are paid in drugs for that, and as often in certain parts of Costa Rica, there's been this uptick in violence in the streets, and the Costa Rican government is really worried about that. So drug traffickers are known to use fishing vessels themselves to smuggle their product into U.S. waters. I don't know if you read about this summer in Miami, the U.S. Customs and Border interdicted a fishing vessel from the Bahamas carrying 150 pounds of cocaine. Here in California, a panga boat, it's a small, mid-sized fishing boat, was found deserted on a shore just this past May in Santa Barbara. The fishing vessel had been used to traffic drugs here, and there have been incidents about other boats in California with fishing vessels and fishermen disguised carrying drugs. And so that's happening pretty regularly, and the Coast Guard is really out watching that. Ambassador from Costa Rica told me a couple weeks ago that, and I tell you, this illustrates more than any the connection, when I think about it, of drugs and IUU fishing. I think it was in 2009, he said, nearly a ton of cocaine was found stuffed in the bellies of dead sharks on a cargo ship coming from Costa Rica, and it was seized in the port of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. I mean, so literally fish, not just the vessel, but the fish being used as the vessel to smuggle the cocaine and smuggle the drugs. I talked a little bit a minute ago about IUU fishing and human trafficking. So Thailand, for instance, more than a third of migrant fishermen from Myanmar and Cambodia have been trafficking on Thai fishing vessels. And these fishermen are often unpaid, they're often abused, they're told that the Thai fishing folks will keep their pay, so they have to pay off this debt. I mean, it's this cycle, and it's happening both on fishing vessels as well as in some of the fish processing facilities on shore. The illegal arms trade, that's another overlap in IUU fishing. The U.S. Navy was telling us not too long ago that out-of-work fishermen have been known to smuggle weapons out of Iran. And engaging with these illicit networks is just it's just attractive to fishing business because sometimes, as the fisheries are depleted, it's easier to make a buck by moving guns or drugs or whatever illegal cargo. So illegal networks, engaging in illegal networks is attractive because the illicit global transnational crime business is estimated right now to be $1.6 trillion globally. 2.2, it's 1.6 trillion to 2.2 trillion a year. So it's going on, it's a big business. So the U.S. really cares about this because they're worried. And I'll give you another example. They're worried about countries like Somalia. Well, let me go back. I'll get back into that in a minute. So, I don't care. It's becoming more and more of a national security concern for our military, our Coast Guard, our intelligence community, because they've really started to see these linkages. They've been following arms and drugs and whatnot, but now they're really getting the fisheries link. So let me talk about Somalia for a minute. So you may be aware that in Somalia, local fishermen, after 5 years of no piracy, have this past year turned to piracy for the first time in 5 years. And there are many reasons why that's happened, but one of them is that their fisheries are becoming depleted somewhat, but more importantly, there's been these huge onslaught of distant water fishing fleets that are illegally fishing in their waters. And the government of Somalia, they're trying, but they really are lacking in governance. There's not a strong management structure, not a strong structure to deal with these distant water fleets. In particular, I hate to keep picking on the Chinese fleets, but there are a significant number of distant water Chinese fleets really preying on the fishery areas off of Somalia. And they've literally done what they can to destroy the infrastructure of the Somali fishermen, ramming their boats, destroying their shoreside infrastructure. So here you have a group of fishermen who they're out of work. They still need to feed their family. They still have to figure things out. You add to that there's a drought going on in Somalia, and there's more folks migrating to coastal areas, the coastal areas where they fish. And suddenly, what a surprise! You have the first Somali piracy in 5 years. It's not the only reason Somali piracy is upticked, but it's a significant factor. All of the Somali pirates have been fishermen. So that's just another example. And there are others just like it, but I'll keep going. So what is the U.S. trying to do about it? What are we and other countries trying to do? So I don't know, have you talked about it all about the IUU Seafood Fraud Task Force that was created under President Obama in 2014? Yeah. Okay. So that was the first time our government decided they had to do something about it. And they decided to take what we call a whole of government approach. And so when you look at that task force, I don't remember exactly how many agencies, it's something like 15 agencies are all on it, because they all have a different role. The Coast Guard is on it because they do a lot of enforcement. The military is on it because they have awareness of the maritime domain. NOAA is there because they help manage fisheries, and U.S. Customs and Borders and the State Department because of treaties and diplomacy. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone was pretty much siloed in their approach. So this task force really brought together all these countries. One of the, they've come up with a lot of very successful things. A traceability program has just been launched to track seafood. The Port-State Measures Agreement became a huge priority, and I'm going to talk a little more about that. As I said, the Defense Department really started focusing on how to take maritime domain awareness and implicate that into IUU. Now, come forward to this administration, and believe it or not, President Trump did sign an executive order to fight transnational organized crime, and talked about wildlife trafficking, which includes illegal fishing, in that order. So they're getting it, even they get it. Dan Coates, who is the Director of National Intelligence, he testified not too long ago before Congress, focusing on the importance of addressing IUU fishing and wildlife trafficking. So, there's a little bit of hope there that they actually think that this is important work to be done. So what are we specifically doing it? What are some of the tools that we're focusing on? When you go after fishing, there are three major components: surveillance, enforcement, and prosecution. And doing one, you got to do all three. If you do one, great. So you have all this great surveillance technology and are able to follow vessels. But if you can't enforce against them, it doesn't really matter. And then if you enforce against them and figure out if you don't have the means to prosecute, then all is lost. So it's really important that all three are considered. And on the surveillance tools, it's the technology growth and explosion has been pretty cool. I mean, everything from small handheld GPS to large-scale radar and satellite systems, their algorithms are being integrated and shared to really track where illegal fishing is taking place. Private companies like Vulcan up in Seattle, or there's Skytruth and Google have come together to create Global Fishing Watch. One's a very public platform, the other is a private platform where they're selling their services, but they're really impressive what they're doing. And these sort of systems have been using vessel monitoring systems. Those are EMS is a satellite-based system that is on vessels to really track where vessels go. And there's AIS, automated information systems, that was originally put on vessels for safety, actually. The problem with AIS is vessels can literally shut it off. And so you can see their track, and then suddenly it goes dark, and that's called a dark target. And when they go dark, then it suddenly starts up again, 6 hours later or whatever. So it gives you a sense, as we track that, there's probably something not so good going on there. And we're getting more sophisticated at being able to, with the big data infusion of our ability to compute and algorithms, to really find out more and more who these vessels are, who is funding these vessels, where they're going. And I think the world is going to close in eventually on this activity. We've got a ways to go, but I feel very optimistic about that. And even NOAA has using their satellites, their weather satellites, they have this thing called night lights. It's on their, it's a satellite that can literally show night light. So a lot of fishing activities happen at night. And so in Indonesia, for example, they're using the NOAA weather satellite night lights to see where the illegal fishing activity is taking place. So that's the surveillance. Then there's the enforcement piece. And we are doing a lot on enforcement. A lot more needs to be done, but the U.S. Coast Guard and NOAA are really stepping up their efforts. The Coast Guard is patrolling, and NOAA are both patrolling at sea and ports in the air. I talked about the IUU. They're doing more and more, the RFMOs, more and more reporting and working really closely with the RFMOs. In 2016, the Coast Guard tells us that they spent 157 days, to be exact, monitoring the seas for IUU activities. The Navy has stepped up their efforts. They before really didn't even think about this. We have these things called combatant commands or co-commands, COCOMs, PACOM, AFRICOM. They literally are starting to have experts in the COCOMs that are starting to focus on this. So the Navy is recognizing it more. We have passed the Port State Measures Agreement. It's a focus on where they really have, vessels coming into ports have to prove that the fish that is entering has been legally caught. And we have 51 parties plus the EU. How many states or countries in the EU? Is it 22? So, that's like 70 plus countries are now party to the Port State Measures Agreement. And so that's pretty significant. And they've ticked up to that number in just the last 3 years. But with the Port State Measures Agreement, there's a huge dearth in the ability to implement and have capacity to make it happen. So that's a huge priority coming forward that needs to be addressed. Does anyone here know what a shipwriter agreement is? You heard of shipwriter agreements? So that's another tool that I think has a lot of merit. That's where literally, we can't be everywhere, but you can put one Coast Guard official on a foreign vessel in their waters, or vice versa, put a foreign authority on one of our vessels, and it just expands the network of authority. You can't have a vessel everywhere, but people can move around pretty well. And the Navy is starting to do that more and more on some of their vessels as well as they're transiting, where they'll allow someone to get on theirs or they'll get on one of theirs. They don't really want to be in the business of going after fishing, but they're getting it more and more, so they're starting to kind of warm up to it. And then data sharing, figuring out ways, I talked about the technology data, just figuring out ways that we can take data and scrub the classified information and make it available, and they're coming up with a lot of new ways to do that. And then the third one, prosecution. Prosecution is probably the toughest because you still have to prosecute in the country where that vessel is from or where the fish is being caught. Where the vessel is being caught and landed. And often you have corruption, you have low capacity, you have laws that don't necessarily work. So you've got to somehow, sometimes it's the police force that is the one that's supposed to address it. So they don't have the training, they don't have the dollars, they don't have the capacity, and frequently they have a failed system. That's one of the areas I'm the most concerned about getting it all the way through the system, is actually the prosecution piece. But when countries are developing these plans, they have to have laws that go through all three. They have to have laws where if this picture through surveillance is going to stand up in court, it's got to be built into the system from the beginning, or when they're apprehended, however they're apprehended, that has to be legally okay. There's so many ways right now where it can fall apart in the prosecution area. So there's a lot of people starting to really think and focus on that. Market-based solutions, that's the traceability piece that I talked about. That's another way of addressing IUU fishing, where you literally trace a fish from where it's caught. Some want to go to bait. In the US, you go to gate. So it's literally where it's caught, you follow it along the seafood supply chain to when it enters US commerce. The EU, they have more of a bait to plate, where the same thing, but they use what's called a red, yellow, or green card, where they literally use the soccer, football metaphor, where they card countries that aren't meeting certain restrictions about tracing and transparency about their fish. So we have the US, who's now implementing it with NOAA, and they're doing a discrete number of species, and we're hoping that they will go to all species. You have the EU that's been doing it for several years, and everyone's pushing hard for Japan to be the next country to set up a traceability program. If we get the US, Europe, and Japan included, that's like 60% of the world market, and hopefully that's going to make enough of a difference that those that are working outside of a transparent and traceable system will just feel so much pressure that they'll step up. Our own situation in the U.S., our own NOAA, it's called SIMP, the Seafood Implementation Monitoring Program. SIMP is much easier. That's supposed to go into effect in January, February. I don't know if they'll make the mark, but what's interesting about that program, at the end of an administration, when regulations are put together, when a new administration comes in, they can look back like 6 months and decide whether they're just going to kill a regulation or not. And they do it, and a lot of them are killed, trust me. This one, the Commerce Department and NOAA decided we're going to keep this one going forward because it really levels the playing field for our fishermen in the U.S. Because, again, as I noted earlier, we have one of the more robust management programs, and we have one of the more honest fishing programs. I'm not going to say it's all perfect. I don't know if you've heard of the codfather up in New England, but that's a case that recently went, where this guy was just ripping off all sorts of fish up there, but they caught him, and he's been prosecuted. So SIMP is going into place. They've decided to keep that one, and some of the others. But it's very controversial. So, like, China has already said that they're going to fight against it with the World Trade Organization, through the WTO. Vietnam has expressed, I don't know if Vietnam will actually do it. And also, there's a group called NFI, the National Fisheries Institute. Anyone heard of them? NFI? Well, what is NFI? It's a U.S. National Fisheries Institute. It's supposed to represent, it sounds like it would represent fishermen. And that's National Fisheries Institute. It doesn't. It represents the processors. It represents the importers. They went up. They took this regulation to court not too long ago. The good news is they lost. It was upheld by a judge saying, this regulation makes sense and it's moving forward. Another tool in the toolbox are marine protected areas. I'm sure you all know what marine protected areas are. They protect ecosystem health. And there are different levels of protection from no takes to some fishery management regulations. But studies have really shown that marine protected areas really bring fish back. They really help. Fisheries, the good thing about fisheries is fish are resilient. But again, MPAs rely on enforcement and effective management, or they're just paper products. And how many people read about the recent big apprehension down in Ecuador, just in transiting through their huge marine protected area, where a Chinese vessel was caught with 6,600 sharks on the vessel near the MPA, transiting through the MPA. They didn't all come from the MPA, but the point was there were a lot of endangered species on that vessel. And, there's a country, Ecuador, that is managing their MPA and they caught this vessel. The last one I'm going to talk about is sustainable aquaculture. A lot of people say sustainable, aquaculture, really? Well, as we lose our ability to have, wildlife, wild-caught fish sustain us, we need to move to another source. And I think it's important, as it's growing around the world, that we focus more on how to make it sustainable. And I'm not talking about those fish, shrimp ponds with all sorts of drugs and hormones and whatnot. There are ways to literally have sustainable aquaculture without, some people say, well, but they use other fish and that's undermined. There are ways to do it without depleting fish stocks, without putting all sorts of chemicals in, and that's becoming more and more prevalent. I talked about the importance of fisheries management, and then the last one is subsidies. We need to end fish subsidies. That's happening more and more around the world. I swear you're going to think I'm a China basher, and I'm not. It's just China is still subsidizing their fishing fleets. They're not subsidizing so much the construction anymore, but they are subsidizing the oil and the fuel on these vessels. And, when they're going a really far distance, the distant water fishing fleets, that's a significant step up from what other vessels have. And, there's a guy, Enrique Sala from the National Geographic, who recently did a study that found that fishing on the high seas, if you took away the subsidized fuel on these vessels that China and other countries are subsidizing, it would not be financially lucrative for those vessels to fish there. So there's a big push right now to end the subsidies around the world. So I'm going to end it there, but I guess what I want to say is there's a lot, it's really complicated. I know I talked on and on, it's super complicated, but there's a lot of people, a lot of experts, a lot of will to address this issue of overfishing. I think that we have to keep in mind that really, IU fishing, as I said, it jeopardizes economic security, it distorts the markets, it undercuts legitimate fishing and legitimate activities. And so, with all its complexities, it's something that's really important for us to, as a whole community, as a global community, we need to keep pushing on it. And the good news is our security community has really started to step up and focus on it. They have the resources, they have a way in the front door currently in Washington and around the world. Thank you. I've got to keep my picture going. That's so exciting. Look at all those new vessels. So, yes, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Somalia. I actually worked as a fishery analyst for Somalia's fisheries this past summer. And so we can have a whole long conversation about the linkages between IU fishing and what's going on. But one of the things that we tried to identify through the data was using fisheries as a way of preventing conflict. And so I'm kind of curious about your work at the Stimson Center and within the security apparatus, if there's been any push of, like, for improved movement of using fisheries as preventing conflict, not just trying to enforce it. And
You mean like if they had strong management and governance? Is that what you mean?
yeah, so the work we were doing with Somalia's government was trying to improve the government's regimes in that capabilities, but also just trying to have a greater transparency on how the movement of the fish are going in Somalia, because also, again, we can talk about this later, we don't have to delve into. I was just curious about the Stimson Center's work elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious that, I think what you're saying is, you know, some people say their fishery is very robust and it's not depleted. Others say it's actually other vessels coming in that are taking the resources and not paying for them. I mean, I think that it's the loss, it's literally the stolen resources for economies and communities. And that places like Somalia, whose government is trying, but is just so lacking in governance, if they could have better fisheries management regimes and laws and enforce them, if they could literally get paid, if they're going to allow vessels in their sovereign waters, if they could literally get appropriate resources from those foreign vessels for what they're taking and manage it appropriately with data collected, and, you know, that's what you need. And that's what Somalia is just one example. It's just they're so close to, you know, where Al-Shabaab and other potential terrorist threats could just pop up. You know, a lot of folks are focusing on that, and then you add the piracy on top of that. So we at Stimson have focused a little bit on it, but more and more sort of focused on, is it a tinderbox, you know, and what can we do to prevent that? And I think having effective fisheries management and getting the finances out of that that are appropriate can be helpful.
So you talked a little bit about sustainable aquaculture. I was wondering, has there been any look at trying to promote small-scale nearshore aquaculture in these areas that are highly vulnerable, rather than just talking about regulating the wild fisheries?
Yes, yes. I mean, you know, your neighbors down the street at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, you know, they have a very impressive aquaculture program. And they're starting to work with several Asian countries. Vietnam in particular is their number one that they're focusing on, but I think also Thailand and Indonesia. And they're trying to figure out, how do we have those small scale aquaculture operations that are sustainable. And they're starting to do assessments right now on that. And you know, it's interesting, Myanmar is one of the countries that they're focusing on. And like, if you fly over Vietnam and then you fly over Myanmar, you know, Vietnam is sort of like, it's, all the trees are gone, you know, a lot of the trees are gone, and there are all these fish ponds, and they're that much further. But Myanmar, because it's been so closed for so long, is, you know, has, you know, trees and forests and tropical jungles and all that, and they're just starting. So it's going to be an interesting study as to get in there before they destroy, you know, and move in that direction. They want to create sustainable aquaculture. I really think it's a big opportunity. for us getting out of a lot of the mess, but it's got to be done right, because boy, it can be done super raw. We go with my buddy over there.
Yes. Can you say a little bit more, or maybe just give me a direction to look in, but for these people, these experts that are embedded in the different Army command areas, what is their job title, and like how could I don't know, what?
Yeah, so they're in what's called the COCOMs, the combatant commands, and I don't know if they're like they're ready to talk to people yet so much. I have a Navy fellow who kind of dials them up when we questions asked. But I think the one to look at most actually, well, there's two. Commander Harry, Admiral Harry, he's the Admiral for PACOM. And AFRICOM's even better. AFRICOM really gets the problem. And when they have to go down to, like, off of the, particularly the western part of Africa, Gabon, in that area, they do exercises, military exercises, and they've started to do more and more military exercises, literally focusing on ID fishing. I'd start there. Also, PACOM is the other one that's starting to do more of it. I was in Thailand a few months ago meeting with USAID, and interestingly enough, USAID always has someone located at these COCOMs, and it's usually for natural disasters, but they're starting to focus a little more on the ID fishing and engaging that way. And so the folks at PACOM were telling me that they're starting to connect, the USAID person is starting to connect more with PACOM. And then we just had Admiral Charlie Ray from the Coast Guard was just at meeting with us, and he was telling us that Southcom, which Southcom is basically run by the Coast Guard. And it's run by the Coast Guard because of all the narcotics. And he told me that for years, they really didn't care that much about fishing, other than, there's a fishing vessel, let's go check and see what it's doing, because they really care about narcotics. But they're now starting to see that actually fishing isn't as much an issue because of these connections I talked about, particularly in Costa Rica, or just from Colombia to the U.S., fishing vessels, and what it's doing in those countries themselves. So Southcom is starting to do it more through the Coast Guard, so there's a Coast Guard guy there. PACOM is starting to focus more on it, and AFRICOM is probably the leader of the COCOMs in their work. Yes?
My question, and I was wondering about the program use that the Indonesians are beginning to do, where they're destroying these confiscated illicit hulls. I suppose my question kind of builds off that, namely, why is this, I guess, only becoming that thing? Maybe there's a distinction that I'm missing here, but it would seem to me that most people, especially those in the I component of the IUU, seem to bear little resemblance to anything but, I don't know, bandits or pirates. People who are coming over and exploiting overseas or resources, right? So why is this a new thing that they're only firing up holes now? And also, if they're on the high seas, doesn't that make them fair game for anyone's navy if they do?
Well, so in the case of Indonesia, it's not on the high seas. It's literally in their waters. And this minister, and I urge all of you to go learn a little bit about Minister Susie Pujastuti. No, because her name is so difficult, she's known as Minister Susie. Check her out. She's amazing. I've been lucky enough to become a friend of hers, and she's this woman who she maybe had an elementary school education. She grew up in a fishing community on one of the archipelagos in Indonesia, and she's brilliant. And she came up through the ranks and literally realized that if they were ever going to really make it, they had to figure out how to get fish to the market. And often these far distant, Indonesia's huge. off these far distant areas, it was really hard. So she realized they needed refrigeration to get their fish to market, and they needed airplanes. So she somehow, I don't know, I think it was she married someone who was able to buy her an airplane, but she got this thing, started an airplane, Susie Air, which started transporting all this seafood around Indonesia to market, and she became very wealthy. She later has become a minister of fisheries, and it's interesting, she's tattooed, you know, cigarette smoking, deep voice, I mean, she is like a firebrand. But she's a force to be reckoned with, and she's recognized that these are fishing vessels, and they're some are Vietnamese. The Chinese were doing it for a while. They backed off a little bit because, you know, the Chinese vessels do not want their vessels being blown up. At some point, they started escorting them with some of their Coast Guard vessels, but still.
Wait, the Chinese are escorting with their own military
yeah.
into foreign waters?
Yes, I mean, but you know, of course, the Chinese may say, well, those are our waters, but there's the whole South China Sea dispute. But these were, in our view, pretty undisputably Indonesian waters. So that just adds a whole nother level of tension there, and another reason our intelligence community. But so in sovereign waters, they are more and more doing that. Why didn't they do it historically? I don't know, maybe because there were more fish. It's now comes down to this lack of resources, competition, scarcity, it creates conflict. And it's economic conflict, it's food conflict, it's, you know, sovereignty conflict. So on the high seas, it is anyone's fair game, but the ocean's really big. There aren't too many people out there patrolling around the high seas ready to, go, after, unless you're Greenpeace and you're like chasing something. But, it's a big ocean. So that's why the surveillance needs to end up somehow to figure into enforcement and following those vessels as they.
Would you feel that the term pirate or whatever would be applicable for them if they're wholesale removing natural resources? Would it be some form of piracy or theft, or?
It's definitely a form of theft. I don't know about, I guess you could say piracy. I mean, piracy to me I tend to think of literally stealing someone's vessel, but yeah. It's without a doubt, it is theft. It is outright stealing of other resources. And on the high seas where they're not governed, it's stealing of other resources, building commons resources.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
I guess what I'm wondering is the very last part of what you said was important, which is the actually taking people to court and prosecuting them. And I believe that is difficult because a lot of times these operations aren't necessarily spearheaded by the people who are out there fishing on the boat, and like you said, a lot of them are pressed into service. So what sorts of efforts are being done to kind of get at the brains behind these operations, since obviously the boats and the people are disposable and not the brains behind the operations?
Right. So, like all illicit networks, they're really happening somewhere else where the money is being transferred and there's a name for it that I'm just having. I can't think of. There's an actual name for what we call this, and I just sort of cramped on that one. But anyway, yes. So the Treasury Department and our CIA and intelligence community is starting to look more and more at how those networks thread, because again, it could be fish one day, arms the next, other black market activities with drugs, and they don't really care what they're black marketing. They're then taking those funds and putting them into supporting terrorism or arms deals or other things. It's just a commodity. They don't really care what the commodity is. So trying to get behind who are the brokers, who are the financiers, what are those networks. There's definitely a very sophisticated group at DNI and CIA and the Treasury that are focused on that. Yes.
So you talk a bit about China.
I'm sorry.
It's really good because I never know this and I was really shocked. So my question is about if your department or the administration is talking with your Chinese counterparts and maybe can put a little bit political or economic pressure on them to make a change, or if there's something on the multilateral setting that can be done.
So I'm sure you followed the news of the last week and our leadership, yeah, they were doing, you know. I mean, if I was your president, I'd be like, you know, skipping down the road. I mean, I feel like our leadership is so, like, wrong in so many ways on the way they're dealing with China. But that said, I mean, when I was at the State Department and we worked a lot with China, you know, it was really interesting to me because the head of the State Oceanographic Administration, SOA, is a great guy and he really gets it. He understands ecosystem, the importance of ecosystems and biodiversity and sustainability and all that. However, he does not run the fisheries program. That's run out of the agricultural and forestry department. So when we met, when they would come to the States and we would meet with them, they had zero interest. They're like, look, we get what you're saying, we gotta feed our people, we gotta employ our people. And what's interesting in China is, and you can probably tell me more, is, you know, there are provincial governments, and the provinces are where the fishing vessels are located. And various provinces are told, okay, you need to employ this many people, you need to feed this many people. And so for the folks who are, I don't know if they're governors or whatever they're called, the province leaders, you know, they're not incentivized because they're sending the vessels far offshore. So it's not affecting their fisheries anymore because their fisheries are all closed. So there's a disincentive for them to be responsible around the world. And with the new Belt Road Initiative, I mean, again, it is opening up ports, roads, airports, you know, to get wherever they're fishing, whatever commodity they're picking up wherever, to get it back home. So there's this huge thing going on right now with China and the world, and trying to work with the Chinese through bilaterals, multilaterals, bilaterals. We did make some progress when we were at the State Department. From what I've heard, all of that progress has pretty much stopped. I'll give you one, you know, I don't know if you followed Antarctica, where they created this huge marine protected area in the Ross Sea. That was one of the last big things we did. The Chinese fought us in creating this marine protected area because it's where they fish for krill. Very little bit, but they do. They're one of the only countries that fish for krill down there. It took President Obama and President Xi literally having a conversation about this. I mean, it was literally, I wrote talking points and I got it to a friend at the White House and they literally got him into the president's talking points. And it was brought up and they cut a deal on it. And then when they cut a deal on it, they forced the Russians to cut a deal on it. Well, also didn't want it. But that's the kind of level of deal making we have found you need. You have to get right up at the top. And right now, we don't have that leadership, and I'm just hoping that somehow we can figure out a way to get to the leaders in China. I mean, one last thing on that, I don't mean to belabor it, but you know, the Chinese did for the Belt Road Initiative. They've done a whole maritime policy, and you read it and it's fantastic. And you say, okay, if you can implement this, the world is going to be saved and there's going to be fish. But what we hear is, it's great in words, but not in action. And my hope is we can get that kind of action through global, not just U.S. pressure, but global pressure. I hope that answered it.
I think on that is a good time to end it. So,
Okay.
so if you people want to kind of stay and introduce themselves, please do so. And thanks again, Sally.